Well, good morning. We are very, very fortunate today to have Jeff with us. Jeff Arnold is the Director of Innovation and Outreach at Leidos Flight Service, and I'm anxious to hear what he has to say because I know I'm going to learn stuff. So really appreciate Jeff being here. This is the very first time that we've done, at least I have done this presentation. This is a completely new one for the FAA safety team. And I'm very grateful that Jeff was willing to help participate and put together the information he's going to share. So with that, I'll go ahead and start. And I want to emphasize, for those that have seen my other presentations, you're going to see that there's stuff missing, that I've shared in the past. And because the purpose of this particular presentation is to focus on the most common mistakes, not everything, but like, okay, where do pilots seem to, trip up on international trips? So where do we get that perspective from? Well, for those that don't know us, we provide services to pilots on international flights, and they fly everything from small single engine piston all the way up to the heavy metal. And we provide a wide range of services to those customers. We also collaborate with industry and associations. We've been under contract with AOPA for going on 16 years. We help their pilot information center. We help AOPA members that have questions or get into trouble. And we also work with NBAA. We're on the planning committee for their IOC. I'm a Bahamas Flying Ambassador and a member of the Bahamas Civil Aviation Council. We've also been collaborating with CBP for over 15 years, and we meet with them multiple times a month to discuss general aviation matters, to see how we can better collaborate, communicate, and get people to comply. Also collaborate with Ops Group. And also we provide services to a number of different entities, companies, associations. One of the things that I was thinking when I talked to Laura was through the helping AOPA members that got into trouble, working with CBP and with our own customers, when we provide our premium services to the customers, the first thing that we do is we review the crew and aircraft and passenger documents, and we look at their equipment codes. And so we see a lot of things as part of that. So I thought, we could take all of that, experience, feedback, and try to put it into this presentation to say, what is it that we see? What are the mistakes that our pilots are making? And hopefully we can help at least one, hopefully more. But even if it's just one, it's worth it. To avoid making the same mistakes and having, either an inconvenience or delay in their trip, or worse, a fine or something like that. So, and again, I'm really excited Jeff is with us because one of the, our premium services are obviously focused more on IFR flights, but we also get a lot on our member website. We have a lot of CST members who are flying VFR to Mexico, to the Bahamas. And Jeff has got a lot of information he's going to share that I think will help everyone understand what we all should be doing and not doing to make these trips successful and fun. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the crew and aircraft documents. One of the common questions we get: do I need a radio operator permit? The answer is yes. It's an FCC requirement. We don't need it to fly domestically, but we do need to fly it internationally. The second issue we see with crew documents are people flying Citation 500, 550, 560. The issue with those aircraft is that the type certificate has a minimum of 2 crew. However, in the US, if you take the proper training from the proper training company, you can obtain an exemption that allows you to fly those aircraft under certain conditions as a single pilot. The thing is that exemption is only valid where the FAA has jurisdiction. And so the FAA has put one of the limitations is you're going to fly internationally, you've got to have authorization from that civil aviation authority. Unfortunately, I've seen the consequences of pilots that didn't have it, and they got into trouble, and it was expensive. And the other thing we see is on international is pilots, again, flying aircraft type that have a type certificate for minimum two crew, with one crew member doesn't have a type rating. If it's an aircraft that requires a type rating, which usually these would. And so they try to get creative. And again, I want to emphasize that is only valid in United States airspace. So if you're a turbine driver, large turboprop driver, just be sure that the type certificate has a minimum of two crew, that you have two properly typed crewmen on board the aircraft. Something we're seeing not in Mexico, Bahamas, but we're seeing further abroad in South America and other countries, is that they take your airman certificate as the privilege you're exercising, not the operation. So if you have an ATP, they're going to expect you to have a first-class medical. Even though you might be flying your aircraft with your family on board, I mean, you're exercising private pilot privileges. They may expect you to have a first class. Now, again, Mexico, the country's near the U.S. We've had this issue in Mexico in a couple of airports. We've been able to get it sorted out, but it's just something to be aware of. If you've got a commercial or ATP and you're going to be flying under a second or third class, you might want to just ask the question of the airport or such before you go, just to make sure you don't have any surprises. In a couple of countries, if you're flying turbojet, if you have a single pilot jet or whatever, they may actually expect you to have an ATP in a first class, or at least a first class medical. Again, not very many and not near the US, but obviously if you're flying a turbojet aircraft, you're going to be wanting to fly further. So again, just make sure that the countries you plan to fly to, you've clarified the airman certificate requirement, medical certificate requirement for the type of aircraft that you're going to be flying. On the medical certificate side, bear in mind, Basic Med doesn't conform to ICAO. So you've got to make sure, if you're planning to fly under Basic Med, that the country you are flying to accepts it. Now, we were talking earlier, and I had a question on an earlier presentation. We know there are multiple scenarios. The Bahamas says it has in writing they accept Basic Med. Mexico has in writing they accept it, but they don't. And then the Dominican Republic says they accept it, but they don't have it in writing. So, in good faith, I try to tell everybody, here's the facts. What I want to avoid is somebody arriving in the country and running into an official that says, hey, why are you flying under Basic Med? Show me, why you're not in violation. So with Basic Med, the important thing is whatever country you plan to fly to, make sure you know for sure that they accept it. The other thing we are required to have for any international flight is the English proficient endorsement. If you don't have it, it's not a big deal. Go to the FAA website, request a new certificate. It gets printed on it automatically. Another big problem we see, and this thing can get really, really ugly, is with people who have renumbered their aircraft. Remember that the minute you put the new number on the aircraft, you've got 5 days to send I think it's AC 6050. It's the form. It'll be on the next slide, to the FAA. And you have 10 days to go to your FSDO and get the new airworthiness certificate with the new tail number on it. And we have seen aircraft that have been flying a year or more since they renumbered and still have the old airworthiness certificate. So if you renumber or have renumbered your aircraft, just be absolutely sure that you have obtained a new airworthiness certificate. What you don't want to do, you don't want to do it in the U.S. Obviously, that's a violation. But if you go into a foreign country, it can get really, really difficult. And unfortunately, we have been called by people asking for help who have done it. Okay, and trying to unravel that thing, it's not pretty. So try not to do it. Experimental, that's the other common question. Can I fly my experimental to XYZ country? And my answer is, it depends. If you look at the airworthiness, it says that you've got to get permission from the countries you're going to overfly or whose airspace you're going to fly through. The newer ones go a step further and say you must bring that permission on board the aircraft to present to an FAA inspector or the civil aviation inspector of the foreign country. Now, again, Bahamas, they have their standardized validation. You print it off. It's not aircraft specific. It's it's a general document. Print it off, put it on your plane. You're in compliance. Other countries that say, make sure you get it in writing so that you comply with the limitation of your own airworthiness certificate. Okay, so if you've got the permission, the answer is yes. If you don't, then no. One of the other mistakes we see, and you would think that the text across the front might be a giveaway, we'll get these. Somebody just bought a plane and they want to make an international trip, and they'll send us this. And it's like, hey, you can't fly with this thing internationally. Call the FAA in Oklahoma City. If you're using a title search company, get them to get you a Flywire. That is a document issued by the FAA to make an international trip. And those typically are accepted because it is issued by the FAA. This document is not issued by the FAA. And of course, once you get the permanent, then you're good to go. And again, if you are going to travel, don't do it under this form. Don't leave the US until the tail number on the aircraft matches the airworthiness, the registration, the insurance, and the weight and balance of the aircraft. And I'll explain those other two in just a moment. Similarly, we get another question: does the aircraft need a radio station license? The answer is yes. The regs say all aircraft require a license unless they're flown inside the United States, or better said, they don't make an international flight. So the answer is yes. Some countries, few, but I'm afraid those will start to grow for private flights that are requiring SMS. Mexico's latest regs, it focuses on charter commercial operations, so there's not an issue there. But Bermuda, that's an example, and we've talked to them about that, like, hey, what's that doing for you? So just something to bear in mind. Insurance, people, again, who've renumbered their aircraft, they forgot to get a new policy. So their insurance policy will still have the old tail number. Whether that does or not validate the policy is separate. I just know what happens when you show up in a foreign country and it doesn't match. And then the tap dancing begins. So make sure if you've renumbered that you don't forget to change your policy to reflect the new tail number. Mexico, a lot of insurance companies put this Mexico warning, okay? That some of them are really like, they're going to take your firstborn, and if you don't have blah blah blah. And unfortunately, in some Mexican airports, they take that as a declaration, not as a warning to the policy holder, but rather a declaration. So what I tell people is on our CFP member website, we have a link, and again, we have no commercial benefit interest whatsoever. It's done out of courtesy to McAfee and Edwards, where you can get a Mexican liability insurance, and you can get it for a year, a month, a week, a day. If you have any reservations or any issues, you can do that. And again, we don't make a penny off of it. We're just doing it as a courtesy because, if you have a problem, and they're not very expensive at all. In the grand scheme of aviation, they're almost insignificant. And check the limits of liability. Mexico's not an issue, but we just had a Falcon, a big plane going to Bermuda, and they were really confident that their insurance policy was good worldwide. And it said worldwide, but the limit of liability did not meet the Bermuda requirements. So that's the other thing you want to check is the country you're going to. If you're going to Mexico, it's about 300,000, so not a big deal. If you're going to Bermuda, then you really want to take a good look. And again, as I said earlier, make sure that the tail number on the weight and balance match the number on the aircraft. Okay, other aircraft docs that we're seeing is the noise certificate. We're hearing more noise or more requests for it in South America. And believe it or not, for those that aren't aware, we actually, in our federal aviation regulations, we have a requirement that says we need to have that information for international trips. And so if you're subject to ICAO Annex 16, which basically we are, we need to carry on board documents that summarize the characteristics. Okay, so that's a US regulation. The good news is there's an advisory circular if you don't have it in yours. And basically, if you're a turbine aircraft pilot, it's going to be in your AFM. The citations, it could be in your performance section or your limitations. Embraer TBMs, it's in performance. Pilatus, it's in the normal, but it's typically in there. Lighter aircraft, single multi-engine piston, it may not be. The good news is that these two advisory circulars give you a mechanism where you can create your own document and find what the correct numbers for your aircraft are. And the European Safety Agency, they have a really neat page. Just Google EASA noise and you can download, and they got all the way back to the Cessna 150, 152. So there are sources, so don't panic if you don't have it. The key thing is just be aware. If they're going to ask for it, just be ready. And Laura was sharing with us earlier that she had actually found a website where you could do that online somehow. So apparently there are different options out there for doing it. So don't panic, but just be aware. For those flying higher performance aircraft, a common error that we see are those that are flying in RVSM airspace under Part 91 Appendix G, Section 9, which basically says if you have ADS-B out, you're in compliance. You know, they specify if you have these other equipment and you're capable of performing to these standards, then by default you can fly in RVSM airspace, but only in U.S. airspace. Most foreign airspace require that we have a letter of authorization, either a BO-46 or the quick one, the DO-98, either one. But most other countries will require a specific letter of authorization. And that's a mistake we see whenever we see a whiskey in the equipment codes. We always query the crew is, do you have, a letter of authorization? And, most of the time they do. But unfortunately, there's been too many times where they're saying, I don't need one. And, here we go. Similarly, when we see an Alpha 1 or a Lima 1 in the RNP codes, that's for RNP 10, RNP 4 airways. It's not just whether the equipment on the aircraft is capable. Do you have the letter of authorization? Because you have to demonstrate training, knowledge, etc. So if you're going to fly Lima routes across the Gulf of Mexico or Mike routes out in the Atlantic, etc., that are RNP 10 airways or RNP 4, make sure you have the correct letter of authorization. And similarly for RNP AR approaches, that's authorization required. And again, you would need authorization for those. Now, one document that we find can really, really help get you out of a lot of situations or fees is this one. If the aircraft is not registered in your name, get whoever is responsible for the entity that owns it, be it club, be it corporation, maybe your own corporation, but just write a letter that says, this aircraft, November 1234, a Cessna, blah, 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 serial number, model number, serial, blah, blah, blah. Crew, the names of the crew are authorized to fly this aircraft to any destination internationally and with the following passengers. And this is a private flight. And what you try to do is draw a line between the name on the registration certificate, the people in the cockpit, the people behind the cockpit, and that it's not a charter. Because there's a lot of focus right now on illegal charter by CBP, as well as by the civil aviation, the FAA, and civil aviation entities outside of the United States. So this is a good thing to have. Also in Mexico, there's some fees that apply to commercial, but not to private. And again, if they see an aircraft, in the name of XYZ Aviation Corporation, even though it's still private, they're going to immediately assume it's a commercial operation, and then they're going to hit you with this other fee, which is like $100. Pull the letter out, and you've got it. Pets. It's not a crew document, but it creates headaches for the crew. We run into this where either the owner pilot or the passengers of an aircraft being flown by professional pilots, they say, I couldn't get a reservation at the kennel, so we're going to bring the family pet with us. Now, that can really create problems because some countries have very strict importation requirements where you actually have to get a permit in advance of arrival. We've seen this happen too many times. So just be advised that if you're going to take a pet on board your aircraft to a foreign country, just having the rabies vaccination certificate alone may not be enough. Okay. And I've seen this become really very, very unpleasant, especially for the pet. that you may be denied entry or the pet may be quarantined, etc. And along with that, we also need to worry about our own country and know that the CDC and APHIS, the Animal Plant Health, I think it's Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. Anyway, those two entities have their own restrictions and prohibitions. And the way they look at a pet entering the United States, it's not where the pet lives. If you're taking your pet from Oklahoma down to another country, they consider the pet's origin is the country you departed from. And so there are some restrictions. They just extended them out into 2024. So if you're planning to take a pet, don't only focus on the foreign country or countries, also check the CDC and APHIS websites and make sure that you know what their requirements are. They're very, very specific. And they say your pet may be rejected, that you may be deported. The pet would have to be returned back to the country of origin. So again, do some research, avoid an unpleasant situation. So now I'd like to jump into equipment. Another error we see is not every aircraft, it may physically be able to fly in the airspace, but there may be additional navigation or communications requirement. I talked about the RNP. There's also HF radio. I was just in Bermuda about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and we were talking with the aviation authorities, and they were sharing with me that we just had 2 aircraft come up from the Caribbean. They just appeared. They didn't have HF radio, so they were totally out of compliance, and it got ugly. And earlier this year, we were talking with one of the controllers from New York Oceanic. Similar thing. An aircraft that just suddenly appeared out of nowhere, no HF, and not good. So make sure you know what equipment is required for the airspace that you plan to fly in. Another common question is, do I need 1090 extended Squitter? The answer is, outside the US, pretty much yeah. I know there's work going on to try to put it into Canada. I think they already are accepting it in certain areas. Mexico's 1090, and most other countries where we've specifically asked this question are 1090 extended Squitter. 12-inch numbers, another common question. It's in 14 CFR Part 45, talks about numbers of the aircraft, the sizes, the widths of the letter, or the numbers of letters, colors, the contrast, the proportion of the letter. And Part 99 tells us we got to have it to cross the air defense identification zone, which Jeff will be talking about in a few minutes. You've got to have them. Now, do they have to be pretty? There's nothing in the rule as long as it complies with the technical specs, but just try to make them pretty, because if you show up in Mexico with funny looking numbers that look like they were just slapped on, yeah, might get a little bit of undesired attention, but there's nothing that says they've got to be painted on there or anything like that. Other common issue that we've seen when we do like our guided expeditions is that some people didn't plan ahead for the geographic region they're going to be in. So make sure your nav database is suitable for whatever country or countries you plan to operate. Okay, make sure you've got the approaches, make sure you've got the route charts, et cetera, et cetera. Outside the US, 406 megahertz ELT prevails, except for the Bahamas. They do have it in their regulations, but pretty much everywhere else, 406 megahertz, a 406 megahertz ELT is required. Another common question, where can I, and unfortunately the question arises once they're in country, where can I get this? And I'm going to tell you, it's going to be hard to find it. But if you want a particular weight oil or even a particular brand, I mean, it gets exponentially more difficult to find. So whatever oil or fuel additive you may need, I urge you to take it with you. We've had people want to do oil change outside of the US. Yeah, it can be done, but you are raising the bar and increasing the probability of a problem. So just plan in advance and bring whatever you need with you. If you need a particular tow bar or tow bar head, okay, most of us are accustomed, landed any FBO in the US, and they got all the different tow bar heads for all possible types of aircraft. Or they have the tug where just lifts up the nose wheel and you pull the plane. And when you get outside the US, that starts to, that dwindles very quickly. So if you need a particular tow bar head and you need to be towed, my recommendation is try upon arrival. If you can coordinate with ATC, is park. If you're not sure they have it, park wherever they're going to want to park you permanently and turn it into the wind. You got a gas turbine engine, especially one if you've got strict limitations on the tailwind component, for engine start. Try to get yourself put wherever you want to be and get it turned into the prevailing wind. Spare parts. Every aircraft that I bought where I've operated internationally, first thing I do is look at the logbooks and see what parts were most often changed. And first thing I do is I buy that part. And it was Murphy's Law in reverse, never had to change it. So my rule was if space and weight allowed, I would bring with me whatever parts I already had. And basically when I flew piston, I would bring an extra mag, a starter, an alternator, and tire tubes. We just had an incident with someone that had a flat very recently. So just think ahead. And if you have it, I wouldn't go out and buy it just for the trip. Those are big expenses for just one trip. But I used to always pack them up and bring them with me. I'd leave them in the aircraft, not unload them with the luggage. Just consider them part of the aircraft equipment. One other mistake I see on airport ramps in Miami, when I see people about to head off to the Bahamas, to save money rather than use. I firmly believe in the constant wear safety vest, because if you don't have it on you when you get in the aircraft, you're probably not going to have it on you when you get out. So a lot of what I always wear, and even if I'm in a multi-engine aircraft, if I'm going to be doing low altitude flying for photography or whatever, at least the crew put on a constant wear vest. Now, to save money, we use the Switlik TSO ones. Other people will buy the marine type, like from West Marine or their local marine supply house. Some of those vests have an automatic inflation feature. I would urge you to really reconsider having that feature activated, because the last thing I would want is for my life jacket to suddenly inflate while I'm still inside an aircraft cabin. And now I'm stuck to the floor or the roof, whichever way the aircraft wound up. So I put that out there for you to think about. I'm going to jump into travel documents. CBP passports. You should have at least the expiration date of the passport should be at least 6 months beyond the date of entry. Many countries, that is a requirement. I have seen passengers deported, denied entry into countries because their passport only had a month left or 3 weeks left. They were denied entry. Also, you should have at least 2 blank pages for the inward and outward stamps of the countries. You should have at least 2. We see these from time to time, and oh my God, these create problems where somebody will file APIS, they'll put the passport card number in. APIS is not going to validate it, it's just going to say we got it. And then they land in the foreign country, and now they have a problem, and they call us, and what do we do? These are not valid for aircraft. These are good for land crossings into Mexico. These are good for sea crossings. These are not valid for flight, neither in the foreign countries nor in the US. So please, if anyone's planning to use one, don't. Only bring a passport. This one keeps popping up. There are, I think it's now 41 visa waiver program countries. Basically, countries where you can fly to the US without having to get a visa, but you get an approval through ESTA. Okay. However, to enter the US under ESTA and from a visa waiver program country, the aircraft must be part of a signatory carrier. So most private aircraft are not signatory to an agreement with CBP, which means you can't enter the US. You can if you have a visa, like a B1, B2 visa. However, there is a loophole in the regs, which is the maintenance of status statute, where if you're still within the visa waiver, within the ESTA period, you can travel to an adjacent contiguous territory or adjacent island. Those are what they call the adjacent islands. I will tell you from experience that you really, really, really want to talk about this with CBP at the port you plan to re-enter. This is now getting out there on the fringe, not very common for many ports to see this. So if you've got any passengers, relatives, friends that want to fly with you to, any country outside the United States, and you plan to bring them back into the U.S., make sure if they're from a visa waiver program country, if they have a visa or if they're under ESTA, and if you're going to have any issues when you try to enter the United States. Okay, APIS and CBP. APIS, I know that apparently we have some questions on what is it. I'm not prepared today to go into APIS. It's the automated passenger or automated passenger information system. eAPIS is the electronic portal that CBP has created to be able to submit APIS. If you've never heard of it, then I urge you, before you make an international trip, you need to become familiar. One of the things that we see that worries us, it's one of our red flags when we're working with a customer, is when there's a disconnect between whoever is providing services and the pilot in command. And the reason is that the pilot in command is legally responsible for any legal outcome of that flight. So when we see people in a rush or the pilot excluded in emails, that for us is a real warning sign. Because again, they don't realize that whatever goes wrong, it's their butt that's on the line. And one of the top penalty action causes is failing to submit APIS, especially the outbound APIS. And people say, well, how are they going to know? Believe me, they know. Another common error is submitting later than 1 hour prior to departure, be it from the US or the foreign country, because the rule says we have to submit APIS and receive authorization no later than 1 hour prior to departure. So you can't just file it, hop in the plane and go. And that's something that gets people into trouble. And now for departure APISs, we have a plus or minus 60-minute tolerance. And that's another top reason for penalty cases right now, is people that are not following the correct procedures. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. Flying on a different date. If your date changes, you have to submit a new manifest. Sounds simple enough, but where do we see people run into trouble? Late night flights. Trying to get back, go to land at 11 p.m., 11:30 p.m., 11:45 p.m., and then headwinds, passengers showed up late, whatever. And now you're looking at midnight and it becomes 12:01. So be advised, you need to be very, very careful with that, because APIS is date specific. Another error people confuse, especially those new to APIS, when you submit manifest, you get this APIS confirmation number. Some people confuse that as the authorization. No, that's just says you transmit it. That's your transmission number. It's not until you get the email back from DHS that you've received authorization. Now, sometimes people don't get it and they'll say, hey, I haven't gotten the email. Can I go? Well, no, because you haven't been authorized. And some of the common causes we see why you don't get an email is you get a typo when you created your account in the email. If you're sharing an account with someone, so they may have changed the email address to where the notifications should go. And on very rare occasions, the DHS servers may have a glitch, and we've seen that too. So no email, no go. Not reading the manifest, not reading the email receipt, the receipt with the instructions. Those that have been flying for a long time are going to say, looks the same as it always has. The first part does. It's everything after that that has changed. And the text in the departure confirmation or receipt email and the arrival email are different now. And they have very, very specific instructions. So I know people would say, I filed APIS, I saw the email header in my inbox, I know I'm good to go. Boy, that's dangerous. Or people just don't read beyond the header. Just they're looking for that, based on the information submitted, this flight is approved for departure. You got to read beyond that. So I urge you to do that because that's getting people into trouble. Another one of the top reasons for penalty case enforcement action is missing people, in the sense of someone's on the aircraft that wasn't on the manifest. Or you submitted one person, but a different person is actually on the manifest. That's a top cause right now for penalty cases. Not checking against travel documents. The only person, especially if you're a professional pilot, the only person that's going to say, I'm looking at the manifest and Joe Blow was born in 1957, and you see some guy walk up, that is, you see a 25-year-old walk up, you say, okay, this can't be, there's an error. This can't be. We can't see it. The only person who can see it is the person that is watching the people get onto the aircraft. So I always urge everyone, even if it's your own family, your own plane, check the manifest against the travel documents. Why? Because we just had an aircraft about a month ago fly all the way down from the US to Argentina. They sent us a copy of the passport. We filed the manifest with it. They just forgot to bring it the day of the flight. And they went all the way down to Argentina and they were deported. And the plane, we had to turn that plane around in 8 hours flight back to the United States and then work with CBP to get the family member to bring the passport. So that's a big error in both directions. Some people have two passports. You could get a second one, so that if you have to send one off for visa, you may bring the wrong one. Okay, so if you filed APIS with one, but you brought the other one, that can be a problem. Or you may have brought your son's or your daughter's or your spouse's passport. You just reached in that drawer, grabbed it, and you thought you had yours, and it wasn't. So yeah, it could be the wrong passport, the wrong person. If you cancel your flight, you should cancel your APIS manifest, and you should receive an email that looks like this. Before, nobody really paid attention to it. They are paying attention to it now. So please, if you have submitted a manifest and you are not going to fly per what you submitted to CBP, please, please, please call CBP and cancel it. Another error, and this comes with people in the north, that the regulations are different depending upon which way you enter the United States. And south, that's the definition. And you must make your first landing at one of 32 airports. There they are. And you should make your first landing at the one closest to the point of coastline or border crossing. Can't overfly one going to another, except for these three: Tucson, San Antonio, Midland. There they be. Why? I can't answer. I'm just a messenger. But it is possible. And Miami allows you, their field office allows us to fly over any one of their 8 airports while en route to another. And they'll consider that the first airport of landing. And I think it was 2018, Marathon was added. It's not on that list in the regs, but it works and functions like an airport, a designated airport. Now, failing to get permission to land, that is something that has become a real hot button for CBP, and it is now one of the top reasons for penalty actions. Even though you filed APIS to return to the United States, even though you've got the receipt email from Homeland Security, you still have to call the port. Now, some ports will want you to call. Others will tell you email. But whatever that method is, you need to follow it. You need to secure permission to land. It's a top penalty case. And another related to that is not complying with the arrival time tolerances. Many airports in the US now have an airport fact sheet. When you get permission to land, they will email you that fact sheet, and it'll give you, if you are granted permission to land at 1 p.m., they may give you plus or minus 30 minutes. It's all on the airport fact sheet, or the officer will tell you that. Another common question that we get, can I do 2 manifests? Because, if the winds aren't right, I may have to fly to the alternate, so should I submit 1 APIS for 1 and 1? No, you can't be at 2 places at one time. So if you've done it, cancel the incorrect one. You only want to submit the one for where you plan to go. Because basically you've told CBP a lie. You said, I'm going to be at 2 places at the same time. That's not a good thing. Another error that we see is people that use third-party systems, or even the CBP portal, where you can store your information, and then when you go to do a new APIS, you grab, you assemble the manifest, you pull the names off the list, and it'll pull along with it their passport. Well, if you get a new passport or you change your address, you have to remember, go back into those systems and change the information there. Otherwise, you would be submitting an incorrect manifest. Again, why we tell pilots, have the manifest in your possession of what you sent to CBP and check it against the travel documents as the rest of the party that's going to be on that aircraft show up. Any authorizations, if you have to submit a new manifest, the 80 previous authorizations are no longer valid. If you have a border overflight exemption, I'm not going to go into that here, but I've talked about it in my others. One error that we see is operator. They failed to put the same operator in the APIS manifest that's on the BOE. Another thing that we run into is we have to tell pilots, I don't want any part of this flight, is, well, the pilot, we have a BOE in the name of this pilot, but he's no longer with us. So we're just going to use it. It's like, no, I don't think so. That is not something you want to do. So again, don't share BOEs. Another thing we run into from time to time, with small CBP ports, somebody knows the CBP, and they'll say, you don't need a BOE, you can just come on in, or you don't need to do this, or you don't need to do that. Well, as CBP General Aviation Headquarters tells us, no officer has the authority to overrule or override U.S. law. So not only could you get in trouble when that buddy is not present the day you actually land, but that officer could also be getting themselves into trouble. So don't hear what you want to hear what you should hear. Okay. Another error, whenever you interact with CBP, always get their initials. Okay. It's really, really important. And you should never be asked to supply personally identifiable information through email, through fax. If that ever happens, if CBP officer ever asks you to do that, push back, ask to speak to a supervisor. Another common error is not having the CBP decal. Remember, it's for the calendar year that you are going to enter the United States. Okay. So make sure you have the right one. Another error, this happened a few months ago. We were contacted and we have found out there have been other cases. The definition of a commercial flight under the FARs, under Chapter 14, are different than under 19 CFR 122, which is the CBP regs. And CBP says for any payment, okay, including money. And what happened, we were contacted, they shared expenses, which under the FAA's eyes, not a problem, as long as you follow the proportional, the proportions as outlined in the regs. For CBP, hey, it doesn't matter. So be advised, and it got ugly for this pilot. Another thing is I've seen too many people lose too much money. We've had this with passengers, did not tell the pilots, didn't tell us, and they showed up with over $10,000. We had one guy in Cancun, he had come from Vegas and had been really, really, really lucky in Vegas and became really, really lucky in Mexico. We had another guy show up with bars of gold and silver. It's like, I don't know where you got it, but anyway, you didn't have as much when you were done. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and Jeff, you tell me how to advance, and we'll go with you.
Awesome. Hopefully you can hear me okay. No issues. Thumbs up. Cool. Uh, Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Arnold. I'm the Director of Innovation and Outreach for Leidos Flight Service. Excuse me, I have a lisp maker in my mouth. I have a brand new retainer, so if I sound funny, forgive me in advance. But um, to tell you a little bit about me, I have been a flight instructor for, gosh, over 15 years now. Worked as a program manager at two large flight academies. Oh gosh, what else? Taught meteorology at a couple of community colleges, and then I went to work for flight service. Spent 6 years as a briefer, 3 years as a manager, and now I'm in this role. And so I've gotten to see the aviation industry from a very different perspective than I think a lot. And a lot of what I'm going to cover today is kind of how this process looks from our viewpoint. And I'll be the first one to tell you, I am not an expert on border crossings. Again, we've processed a ton of them. So if you find anything that seems incorrect, please make it known, because we love finding mistakes in PowerPoints, because that just gives us an opportunity to improve them. With that being said, I'm going to ignore this topic screen, because it's actually incorrect at this point. I didn't come back in and update it. But some of what we're going to talk about: Miami, Canadian, Mexican border crossing procedures and what they look like from our end, and kind of what we need to be able to process everything. And then we'll talk about flight plans a little bit. So kicking off with Miami and Caribbean flights. These are VFR flights to and from the Caribbean. They can only be conducted, again, daytime only. You must have an assigned squawk code prior to crossing the ADIZ on the return flight back to the U.S. And you can obtain that squawk code several different ways. And I kind of tested our system as Rick was talking, and I filed kind of a fake flight plan into Mexico. And on our website, it'll pop up a pop-up window that says your beacon code is 1201. Or something to that effect, right? So we're able to deliver that squawk code directly to you if you file on 1-800-WXBrief.com with a pop-up window. Also, if you're flying, for example, to Key West, if it's a U.S. airport to U.S. airport, also have to have a squawk code to cross the ADIZ. So you're going to see a recurring theme. If we're crossing the ADIZ, you need to be on a flight plan, and you need to have a squawk code. That's really the recurring theme here. I learned a little bit about Cuban overflights when I was putting these slides together. Again, there is a specific certificate of authorization that you need to overfly Cuban airspace, and you must have an alternate airport on file. Make sure that when you file your flight plans, you file them with valid phone numbers. So double check them for typos. My fingers tend to hit 6 buttons at once. So do your due diligence and make sure that we've got a good way to get a hold of you. And again, in my experience, the less that the federal government or border control has to wonder what is this person doing, the better off you tend to be. If you're filing with a call sign, and for example, a call sign would be Rodeo 1, Rodeo 2, whatever. Make sure that you put your aircraft's tail number in the remark field. And you can see on my slide here down in bullet number 6, you would kind of code that in the others, the remarks field, like so. And I believe that's field 18 or 19. I have to double check. Apologies. Next slide, please. So Mexico is an enigma when it comes to flight plans and border crossings, and I want to emphasize a lot of what I'm referencing here today is VFR flight, and IFR is kind of handled differently, and I really don't go too much into that. So for reference, Flight Service owns all of the VFR flight plans in the lower 48. So if you follow VFR flight plan, Flight Service is responsible for that. So it's really best practice to pre-file your flight plans to minimize delays. Mexico is notorious for not acknowledging flight plan messaging. Why that is, I'm not sure, but that has always been the case. And we'll get a little bit more into this as we go further. But so if you file a flight plan, make sure that you also file a return flight plan back to the U.S. because Mexico doesn't always send flight service your flight plan if you file while you're down in Mexico using their system. Again, why that is, I'm not entirely sure. But what this will do, this will avoid you having to air file as you cross, the border and obtain a code. We've seen this this CAT scan several different ways in the past. We used to have pilots that would file, for example, Brownsville to Brownsville with a Mexican airport in the route of flight. And so they would file that flight plan just so that the messaging gets sent to flight service, and then they would immediately cancel it and go on about their day. Again, when we start talking about these flight plans, what we're really talking about is the coded messages that get sent to various air traffic facilities whenever you hit the file, activate, or cancel or close button. Bullet number 2 on your screen. So this is a little known fact. Flight service has a couple of direct lines for, international flyers, and this is mostly aimed at the southern border. So I really don't have any direct phone numbers for, say, Miami or the Canadian RCOs. But what you can do, you can call these international lines and you can get into a briefer and you can amend your flight plan anytime. Again, as Rick noted, anytime you have a significant change to ETA, date, anything like that, you need to amend your flight plan ASAP. And lastly, and this is kind of a good rule of thumb, really recommend that pilots check NOTAMs for RCO outages. And that RCO, that's a keyword that you can search for in the NOTAM. So you can type in RCO and it should, highlight if you do a find. But RCOs are what flight service use to talk to you in the air. So it's just a remote communications outlet, and that's how we're able to communicate. Really, best advice with this stuff is, be on time and be where you say you're going to be. The U.S. Customs Border Protection Air Marine Operations Center, who watches the radar on the border, they 100% they can see you. And we get calls all the time from Air Marine, and they would say, "Hey, I've got a target, crossing the border. Do you have a flight plan? Do you have any information on it?" If we have that information, we'll forward it to them. The last thing we want is for anyone to get into trouble. Next slide, please. So talking about Canada gets a little strange, and I'll confess that this turned into a little bit of a head scratcher for me as well. But again, with all of these, I think pre-filing is really, really important because it makes sure that you have enough time. If there are any issues with your flight plan or any other issues, you have enough time for that stuff to get looked at and addressed before you hit send on a flight plan, jump in the plane, and go. Well, if there are issues with that flight plan, that window for amendment is kind of passed as soon as we launch. We can still make air amendments, no problem. But it's just a little bit harder to kind of work it out and figure out what needs to happen. So if you're exiting the U.S., again, Canada requests that squawk code, be entered into the flight plan prior to activation. Again, you can do that by filing online with us. You can do that by calling us over the radio, and in all instances, you can obtain that squawk code either from flight service or you can call the center and get that squawk code as well. If you're flying out of the Seattle Center area, we have a letter of agreement with them that requires flight service to issue that squawk code. So again, you can get that on the phone, you can get that online via pop-up window, or you can call us in the air over the radio as well. I want to really quickly, and I've learned long ago not to take anything for granted, but I want to emphasize that there is a very, very big difference between filing your flight plan and activating your flight plan. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a slide or two, but when you hit the file button, you're sending a coded message to any air traffic facility that has jurisdiction across your route of flight, and you're saying, I am planning to depart this airport and go to this one at this time and date, right? So any amendments kind of updates that message string that goes out to ATC, and that's why the flight planning is so important. To enter the U.S., and I've got to go back and do a little bit of homework on this one, but they recommended when I called down to Fort Worth and DC Flight Service and talked to my guys in operations, they really recommended that you file based on a U.S. Location ID in the departure field. So, for example, you could use a NavAid, and you've got 360, which is north, and then 35 miles. So, you can do something like that to show that if we have a NavAid kind of right on that northern U.S.-Canada border, well, 35 miles north of that is in Canada, is essentially what we're saying, if that makes sense. You'll want to activate your flight plan, again, obtain your squawk code by whichever method works for you. And again, goes without saying, make sure that you close those flight plans upon arrival. We have a lot of different mechanisms for that. Easy activate, easy close. You can do it via text. You can do it via the phone automation before you ever get to a briefer. If you call us 1-800-WX-BRIEF, and again, you can do it online. I threw a couple of notes down here, and I've got to fact check some of these, especially the first one. From what we were able to find, and again, please take this first note with a large grain of salt. Activating a VFR flight plan via third-party vendors, so in other words, Garmin or ForeFlight, does not issue a squawk code as far as we are aware. So if you do activate a flight plan, file and activate a flight plan via Garmin or ForeFlight or whoever, I'm not sure if they're going to give you a squawk code. So you may want to double check that. And if anyone's able to fact check that, I appreciate the info. I'll update these slides. But as far as we know, that has to be obtained from center or flight service. Flight service does not process, receive, or handle any EAPIS items. I'm sure they know what EAPIS is, but it just really has no intersection with our duties whatsoever. And the last note here, I'm kind of on a lifelong crusade to end round-robin flight plans. And the reason why we so I'll give you a little bit of history. We had a gentleman that filed a round-robin flight plan into Canada over the weekend for a hunting trip. This was many, many years ago. This was a very common thing. But the problem was when he got to Canada, again, with a round-robin, your search and rescue doesn't begin until 30 minutes after your arrival, your ETA. Well, with a round-robin flight plan, if he departs on a Friday, his ETA is Monday. So God forbid if something happens on Friday and his aircraft crashes and no one's saw or witnessed it, it's going to be Monday until we start the formal search and rescue process to try and track this individual down. So again, round robin flight plans get really weird, especially again, these are coded messages to air traffic. From a safety standpoint, I don't like them. From a filing standpoint, they just tend to kind of muddy the waters. Next slide. So we'll talk a little bit about the ADIZ, and I think everyone on the call should have a decent idea of what that is. But again, I just pulled this definition straight out of Google, right? The Air Defense Identification Zone, it just kind of surrounds the lower 48, and the U.S. maintains that ADIZ. They also maintain two zones, one for Hawaii and Alaska, and then another one for Guam as well. So again, Air Defense Identification Zone. What rules do you need to follow? You need to be on either a defense, a DVFR flight plan, again, defense VFR flight plan, or an ICAO flight plan to penetrate. And yes, again, they can see you on radar. Next slide. So common border crossing mistakes that we see, at least on our end, and this gets a little tricky, is not either missing your fur boundary crossing EET times, or not putting them into your flight plan at all. So again, this goes into the other information section of your flight plan. But what you're doing is and I kind of drew that and measured that out on one of the maps that we use here at Flight Service. But if you were departing San Antonio, we draw this line from San Antonio down to the border, which is the first, border crossing, or at least boundary crossing for your EET times. Okay, so that's 192 miles. Just for easy math, I'm going to say that I happen to be flying at 192 miles an hour today. So it's going to take me 1 hour to get to the US border. So I'm going to enter that into my EET time. Uh, Sorry, my box kind of got drawn weird, so this looks funny, but this is kind of what that would look like. EET, I'm crossing Mike Tango Yankee, and that's what this border is. Again, you can see this is Monterey. You're crossing into Monterey's airspace as soon as you cross that southern Texas border. So you're saying, hey, I should hit Monterey's airspace at 02 Zulu, and then I should hit Mexico City's center border down here at about 4:15 Zulu. So again, those do go into the EET sections of your flight plans. Next slide, please. We talk about a couple of other common errors in search and rescue. Again, and this is where if something looks weird, again, please speak up. But Miami and the Caribbean do have letters of agreement as far as search and rescue are concerned, namely Nassau and Freeport. They have some very specific procedures that they follow. Again, neglecting to enter your EET time in the other field for fur boundary crossings, that could inadvertently trigger search and rescue procedures being generated or activated. And again, warning to the wise, Mexico just does not tend to acknowledge flight plans for whatever reason that is. Again, looking at the right side of the screen, filing round robin flight plans, I think I've beaten that horse to death. Assuming that ATC will pass along a flight plan closure to flight service. This is an interesting one because I've had this happen to me as a pilot. I've been on a VFR flight plan and I've asked Center. So I'm on a VFR flight plan with VFR flight following. I'll get into this in just a minute. But I'm on the horn with Center getting VFR flight following, and I make a request. Hey, I need you to cancel my VFR flight plan. To date, I'm about 50-50 on Center actually closing the loop on that and getting it done. To close your VFR flight plan, Center has to stop what they're doing, figure out what flight service sector they're supposed to call, and then they call out there to close the flight plan. Again, why that has such a low success rate, I really don't know, and I'm not willing to speculate. But just be very careful with that. The best way to know that your flight plan is closed is, again, we keep a record of all this stuff online, but you can always reach out to us, and we should be able to tell you very quickly. Again, it is always the pilot and command's responsibility to close their flight plan, and again, not contacting or receiving a squawk code prior to crossing an ADIS is a surefire way to get unwelcome attention. Next slide, please. And so we talked about what are the differences between VFR flight following and a flight plan. So, I've been surprised to find, and I'm not throwing rocks with this statement, but I've been surprised to find how many pilots don't truly understand the difference between the two, because they are two very different products, even though they sound the same. So VFR flight following is kind of voluntary, workload permitting, but what you're getting radar services and traffic advisories from air traffic control. Again, this is workload permitting and voluntary. No search and rescue services are guaranteed. Now, granted, if you're receiving VFR flight following and you start yelling Mayday into your mic, they're going to help. Right. That's really the common denomination with all of the air traffic services. They will always stop whatever they're doing and help anyone that's in distress. VFR flight plan is different. Again, that is a record of your flight. Search and rescue services are guaranteed. It has to be activated after it's been filed. Again, if you just hit the file button, but you never close that loop by hitting activate or close, it just sits there and then it automatically falls out of our system after 2 hours. So there's really no need to call and cancel proposals as well, unless you have multiple and you don't want to get confused, like, what flight plan am I supposed to be opening? Those, again, unactivated flight plans will fall out of our system after 2 hours. And again, your flight plan serves as an internally coded notification or message of arrivals and departures in the National Airspace System. The National Airspace System still uses a coded messaging system called Service B, and that's really what your flight plan is. They take your flight plan, they reduce it down to one line of code, and they send it to the center. Another interesting thing, and this isn't on the slides, typically the remarks sections of your flight plans are not transmitted unless they're specifically requested to be. For whatever reason. So again, if you're putting a note to the controller, I had one guy, he called for a briefing and he said, "Hey, do you mind putting behind the airplane in the remarks section of this flight plan?" I said, "I will," and I understood what he meant, but I said, "I don't know if anyone will see it, so just FYI." Switching over to the defense VFR flight plan that I mentioned earlier, again, I asked the question and I still haven't gotten a satisfactory answer. Is there any reason why we would file DVFR and not just a regular ICAO VFR? And from what I've been able to find, and I'm going to keep digging on this, but DVFR flight plans are typically used for ADIZ penetration activities that don't involve landing outside the U.S. So, for example, out on the Pacific or up in, say, Massachusetts, I know they do fish spotting quite a bit. We see a lot of aerial photography missions that penetrate the ADIZ on the southern border, things like that. Again, this does, the thing with DVFR flight plans, this actually sends a specific arrival and departure message to Customs and Border Protection, Air Marine Operations Center, and also the centers. Again, those are the various control agencies on the border. Next slide, please. That's all for me. I'm sure there are a few questions that we'll try to get to. I've got a quick feedback survey here. It's 6 questions. The first 3 are, hey, how horrible were the presenters? How horrible was their presentation? I'm kidding. It doesn't say that. In the next 3, if you have any suggestions, we love to hear them at Fly Service. Again, everything we do is free. I hate to use the 4-letter F word there, free, but here we are. So again, if you have any suggestions, please send them our way. We'd love to hear from you. Here's my contact email. Again, response times may vary, but I promise I will get back to you. That's all for me, Rick.
Okay. One last section that I was going to cover because it's a very common question. Safety abroad. And basically, my answer is there's 2 things. You need to either be a victim and you need to have an environment in order for a crime to take place. So I'm from the Bahamas and I've seen lots of tourists over my life. And, you get some that are very discreet and very low profile. And then you get some that are flashing the Rolex and the money and bragging and, how successful and how big their house. That's really not a good idea. And going off the beaten path, that's not a good idea either. And one of the things that, people say is, well, I went to this country. I really like this taxi driver, so I kept using them. Yeah, but do you really know who that person is? The first time they didn't have time to plan, but if they know they're going to come back and pick you up in the afternoon, if that person had any bad intentions, then now they've had a time to plan. So again, don't make yourself a victim and don't create the environment. Quickly, some resources. We've redone our website for those that haven't seen it. And speaking of Cuban Overflight, we have an online service for that. If you're a member of our member website, you get a discount. And basically, our system is tied to the FAA and to Cuba. And if you go through there, it's available 24/7. We put a bunch of stuff on that website: international weather, fuel prices, ports of entry, videos, procedures, country information. So it's a good resource. And you will get discounts on all our services. So that a little bit about that. And if you have a flying club or a group and you want us to help put a trip together to a particular country, we do that as well for flying groups and associations. And another big resource is, I know Gracie is on this call. She's from our marketing department. And they've done a ton of work to produce these short videos. I think Laura had one prior to the start, and it's putting information out there. It's free. It's available. We also have a YouTube channel